A queen watches a fleet of black sails return from a conquered shore. King Tar-Míriel stands atop the holy mountain of Minaltarma, her heart heavy with a terrible secret. Her people, the Númenorians, have defied the gods themselves, worshipping the Dark Lord Morgoth in forbidden temples. This single act of pride has placed the entire island kingdom on a collision course with divine wrath, risking utter annihilation. By the end of this tale, you will understand the true cost of defying the natural order and how a single choice can sink a kingdom beneath the waves. We will uncover what drowned this glorious civilization and how a tiny seed of hope survived the flood. Where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? What do you believe is the final price of a civilization that challenges the gods? The heart of Númenor beat within the marbled halls of Armanelos, a rhythm now grown frantic and dissonant. It was here that Queen Tar-Míriel finally confronted the source of the kingdom's fever, her own cousin, the King Ar-Pharazôn. His throne was a testament to stolen power, and his ambition had become a poison in the city's veins. She found him not in quiet council, but overseeing a terrible act, the echoes of axes ringing through the polished stone. He had given the order to cut down Nimloth, the white tree. This was no mere plant, you see. Its roots were said to be tangled with the fate of the land itself, a living symbol of the kingdom's bond with the divine. To destroy it was to sever that last, fragile thread. Míriel's voice, though filled with the authority of the true line of kings, was a desperate plea against the din. She demanded he halt this sacrilege, to see the folly of his actions, but Ar-Pharazôn's eyes burned with a cold and terrifying fire. It was not the warmth of conviction, but the icy glare of pride. He saw the tree not as a sacred trust, but as a relic of a weaker age, a symbol of the very limits he sought to overthrow. His refusal was absolute. In that moment, the schism within Númenor was carved as deeply as the blades into the white bark. This was no longer a simple disagreement. It was a declaration. Ar-Pharazôn was not merely rebelling against tradition. He was waging a war on history itself, his thirst for immortality blinding him to the very foundations crumbling beneath his feet. Torchlight flickered against the polished stone of the palace courtyard, revealing the grim silhouette of the white tree. Isildur stood in the shadows, his breath held tight in his chest. He watched as the king's men, their faces hard with purpose, raised their axes against Nimloth the Fair. Each strike was a wound upon the soul of the land, a final, violent rejection of the old ways. But Isildur, his heart aching with a loyalty his king had forgotten, saw not just an ending, he saw a single chance. As the ancient tree groaned and began its terrible fall, he moved with a desperate speed. He did not try to save the whole, for that was now impossible. His hand darted into the splintered branches, his fingers closing not around wood, but around life itself, a single, perfectly formed fruit that had escaped the blades. He clutched the precious treasure to his chest and fled into the night. The alarm was raised almost instantly. Shouts echoed through the winding streets of Armanelos, and the pursuit began. Isildur was no longer a lord of Númenor in that moment. He was a fugitive, running through the very city of his birth, the torchlight of his pursuers casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to grasp at his heels. Every corner turned was a gamble, every darkened alley a temporary refuge. The fruit was not heavy, yet its weight was immense. It was the entire memory of a covenant, the fragile, living proof of a bond that Ar-Pharazôn sought to erase from the world. In that desperate flight, the fate of a future he would never see was carried in the palm of his hand. This was not an act of rebellion for power or for pride. It was an act of pure, defiant faith. Isildur risked everything, his life, his position, his very name, for a symbol. He preserved a seed, a silent promise that even as the great kingdom crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance, a tiny echo of its original glory might yet survive. He escaped the city that night, but he could never return home. He had stolen the last memory of light from a land that had chosen the darkness, becoming an outlaw for a hope he himself would have to plant in foreign soil. The stolen fruit had already taken root, a fragile sapling cradled in a hidden garden. Its pale leaves trembled in the sea breeze, a stark contrast to the dark purpose now consuming the island. For Isildur and his family, the time for hiding was over. The final break came not with a public decree, but in the hushed, urgent whispers of a secret council. They were the faithful, a dwindling number who still held to the old truths, and they knew Númenor was a ship headed for a cliff. Their only choice was to abandon it before it shattered on the rocks. On a moonless night, with the city of Armannilos glowing like a false dawn in the distance, they moved like ghosts along a deserted quay. Their ship was not one of the king's grand vessels, built for war and conquest, but a smaller, swifter craft, chosen for its silence and speed. They loaded it not with gold or weapons, but with a different kind of treasure. Ancient scrolls, star charts, and the heirlooms of their houses were carefully stowed away. But the most precious cargo of all was that young tree, its roots carefully wrapped in earth from the very land they were fleeing. Each member of this small band was making an impossible choice. They were severing themselves from their homeland, from their histories, and from everyone they had ever known. They were becoming exiles by their own will, cast out not by a king's order, but by their own conscience. As the sails caught the wind, and the dark outline of Númenor began to shrink behind them, they did not look back with hatred, but with a profound and terrible grief. They were not just saving their own lives, they were carrying a memory across the sea, a tiny, living echo of what their kingdom was meant to be, leaving the grandeur and the glory to its doomed fate. The sea winds that carried the faithful to safety now carried back the scent of smelting fires and fresh-cut timber. In the heart of Armannilos, King Ar-Pharazôn's humiliation curdled into a rage that would reshape the world. His own kin had defied him, stealing a symbol of the old ways right from under his nose, and whispering in his ear was his most cunning counselor, the captive Lord Sauron, who offered a solution so audacious it silenced all doubt. He would not merely rule an island kingdom, he would challenge the heavens themselves. Thus began the labor of the great Armament, a mobilization of pride and terror that consumed the entire island. The king's command echoed from the palace to the smallest village. Every able-bodied man was pressed into service. Every forest, once the pride of the land, was sentenced to the axe. You have to picture the scale of this. Ancient groves that had stood for centuries, their branches home to songbirds and their roots, holding the very soil together, were systematically erased. The ringing of woodcutters' blades became the new rhythm of Númenor, a constant, grim percussion replacing the natural silence. The shipyards stretched for miles along the coast, a frantic, swarming city of its own, building not for trade or exploration, but for a single, terrifying purpose. This was not just the construction of a fleet, it was the physical binding of a nation to a single, disastrous path. Every tree felled was another step toward a point of no return. The island itself was being stripped, its beauty sacrificed to fuel a king's wrath, and as the skeletons of thousands of warships rose like a forest of dead trees along the shore, the people of Númenor saw their future taking shape. A vast, dark arrow pointed at the one place they were forbidden to go, the Undying Lands in the west. A profound silence began to creep over the shores of Númenor, a quiet so deep it felt unnatural. The relentless noise of construction, the shouting of thousands of workers, and the crash of falling trees had been the island's heartbeat for so long. Now, as the last war vessel was fitted for its terrible voyage, that heartbeat faltered. The sea, once a familiar companion to the greatest mariners the world had ever known, grew strange and watchful. Fishermen who had braved the open ocean for generations now found themselves hesitating at the water's edge. The waves did not crash upon the sand with their usual rhythm. Instead, they seemed to slither ashore with a cold, hushed breath, and when they retreated, the sound was like a long, sorrowful sigh. On still nights, those who lived by the coast would shutter their windows, not against a storm, but against the voices. They spoke of hearing a low, mournful keening woven into the wind, a wordless lament that seemed to rise from the very depths. It was not the cry of any beast they could name, but the sound of the world itself groaning under a weight it was never meant to bear. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with coming weather. Birds ceased their coastal flights, and the gulls fell silent, as if the natural world was collectively holding its breath. This was no longer the welcoming sea that had borne the Númenorians to glory. It had become a mirror, reflecting back the profound imbalance their king had created. The ocean itself was recoiling, its ancient, patient spirit now whispering a final, desperate warning to a people who had forgotten how to listen. The silence broke with the roar of a million throats. From the sprawling harbor of Romana, the great armament began its unholy pilgrimage. King Ar-Pharazôn stood at the prow of his flagship, a figure sheathed in gold that reflected no warmth, only the cold fire of his ambition. His fleet was a floating city of wood and wrath, so vast that its countless sails truly did blot out the sun, casting a premature and shifting twilight upon the water below. Their course was set with a terrifying clarity, westward, toward the one place they had been forbidden to go for all the ages of their civilization. This was not a voyage of discovery. It was an invasion of heaven itself, the ban of the valor, the one sacred law that had defined the boundaries of their world, was not just being tested. It was being torn apart by the oars of his ships. Every stroke towards the horizon was an act of ultimate defiance, a declaration that no power, divine or otherwise, could tell the king of Númenor what he could not possess. He was not sailing to ask for immortality. He was sailing to conquer it. Think of the sheer audacity of that single moment. An entire civilization, the pinnacle of human achievement, had collectively pointed its spear at the gods, believing its own power could overwhelm the very architects of the world. This was the pivot upon which all fate turned. The natural order, patiently maintained since the world's beginning, held its breath, waiting for the inevitable response to such an unthinkable challenge. The golden prow of the king's ship ground into the white sands of Aman. Ar-Pharazôn took his first step onto the Undying Lands, his boot sinking into soil no mortal foot was ever meant to touch. He expected a challenge, a glorious battle against angelic hosts. Instead, he was met with a silence more profound than the deepest ocean trench. The Valor, the guardians of the world, did not raise a hand against him. They saw his act not as a war to be won, but as a fundamental rupture of the world's design, a crime so vast that their own power to govern was now void. They stepped back. They laid down their guardianship of the world and spoke a single, world-altering word of appeal to the one power above them all, to Isildur, the Creator. And the Creator answered. The sky did not crack with thunder. The earth did not shake. The change was far more fundamental. It was as if a great, invisible gear in the machinery of reality shifted. The very shape of the world was bent. From that moment, the world was made round. The straight road, the direct path that had once connected the mortal lands to the undying realm, was taken away, hidden forever from all but a chosen few. Think of the sea not as flat, but as the surface of a vast, perfect sphere. You can sail for eternity and never again find that secret way. The consequence was absolute and eternal. The Undying Lands were removed from the circles of the world, not in distance, but in nature. A sailor could never again reach them by mere perseverance or pride. The path was closed, the connection severed for all time. The price for setting foot on that sacred shore was not the death of one arrogant king, but the reshaping of the entire world for every person who would ever live after. But for Ar-Pharazôn and his grand armament, the reshaping of the world was not a philosophical shift. It was an avalanche of pure, physical fury. The very sea upon which they had built their pride turned against them. The waters did not merely swell. They reared up into impossible, liquid mountain ranges that blotted out the sky, their peaks collapsing with a roar that drowned out the screams of a million men. The sky did not just darken, it cracked open, not with rain, but with a continuous, blinding fire of lightning, as if the heavens themselves were shattering. Then came the abyss. The floor of the great sea did not simply give way. It was torn asunder, a chasm of such immense depth and breadth, opening beneath the fleet that it seemed to swallow the very concept of light. The sea poured into this new-made void, and with it, every single ship, every golden standard, every soldier who had moments before stood ready to conquer paradise. There was no glorious last stand, no final epic battle. There was only the inexorable, roaring pull into the crushing dark. In a single, terrible moment, the greatest military force ever assembled by humankind was erased, not by an army of gods, but by the world itself recoiling from their touch. The silence that followed was not the quiet of the deep ocean. It was the absolute, final silence of a chapter of history being slammed shut, the echo of a kingdom's pride swallowed by the waves it had once mastered. The tremor began not as a shake, but as a deep, resonant hum that traveled up through the soles of their boots in the port of Romana. Elendil stood frozen for a single heartbeat, his hand gripping the rail of their prepared ship. Then the hum became a groan, and the groan became a roar, a sound of such immense, world-ending fury that it seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. It came from the west, the direction of the forbidden voyage. Every head turned as one. What they saw rising on the horizon defied all reason. A wall of water, black against the bruised and lightning-torn sky, was racing toward the island. It was not a wave as they understood waves. It was a moving mountain range of ocean, its peak higher than the holy Meneltarma itself, its shadow swallowing the light and the hope of the world as it came. In that impossible sight, every whispered fear, every prophecy of doom became terrifyingly real. There was no time for grief, no moment for a final lament for the kingdom they loved. The choice was now absolute and brutally simple. They could stand and be erased from existence with the land of their fathers, or they could trust their lives to the sea that was about to become a weapon of divine judgment. Elendil's voice cut through the paralyzing dread, a single command of raw survival. Cast off, cut the lines, now, the 9 ships of the faithful, so small against the approaching annihilation, pitched violently as their sailors scrambled to obey, fighting to point their prows into the very wave that sought to crush them. They were not sailing away from Númenor. They were fleeing directly into the maw of its death. The 9 ships were their only sanctuary in a world coming apart at the seams. Elendil's command was not a suggestion, but a desperate act of salvation against a tide of chaos. Panic had already seized the port of Romana, a frantic, screaming scramble as people realized the mountain of water on the horizon was not an illusion. The faithful had to fight their way through this terrified crowd, not to plunder, but to preserve. They hauled their precious cargo up the gangplanks, the young white tree, sapling, carefully shielded from the buffeting wind. Every scroll, every heirloom, every child they managed to pull aboard was a victory against the coming oblivion. This was the ultimate test of their long-held faith. For years they had been mocked as cowards, clinging to outdated traditions while the king promised eternal glory. Now, in the final hour, their foresight was the only thing standing between their lineage and utter extinction. They were not abandoning their homeland. They were rescuing its soul from a body that was already doomed. As the last ropes were cut and the sails strained against the unnatural gale, the ships were flung forward, climbing the base of the colossal wave like a challenge. They were placing their lives in the hands of the very sea that was drowning their world, trusting that the providence they had honored would guide them through the storm that was punishing the pride of others. The great green wave did not crash upon the shore. It consumed it. The roar was not of water, but of the world ending. Stone walls that had stood for 1,000 years dissolved into dust before that liquid mountain. The marbled palaces of Armenilos, the grand shipyards of Romana, the terraced farms and the ancient forests, all were erased in a single, churning moment. The wave did not recede. It kept coming, a relentless, rising flood that poured over the plains, swallowing the land whole. High in the city, Queen Tar-Míriel felt the tremor become a deafening collapse. She saw the water coming, a shadow flowing through the streets, lifting entire towers from their foundations. In that final, terrible instant, her pride shattered. The warnings she had ignored, the compromises she had made, the secrets she had carried, all crystallized into one clear, agonizing truth. Her kingdom was paying the price for its defiance, and she was its queen. Her duty was not to flee, it was to bear witness. She turned her back on the drowning city and began the ascent. She climbed the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, the one place on the island where no weapon had ever been drawn and no blood ever spilled. It was a sacred space of peace, and she sought it now as her kingdom died in violence below. The wind tore at her robes, the spray of the dying land stinging her face. She climbed not as a ruler, but as a penitent, a solitary figure scaling the altar of a world she and her people had broken. With each step, the water followed, climbing the sacred slopes behind her. It was a desperate race to the summit, a final, futile plea for a mercy she knew would not come. She reached the peak and stood there, a tiny speck against the wrath of heaven, looking out over the churning, gray sea that had once been her kingdom. The water rose to her ankles, then her knees, a cold, final embrace. Her last sight was of the unbroken ocean, and her final act was one of acceptance, a silent apology to the gods as the waves closed over the last high place of Númenor. The roar faded into a deep, gurgling sigh as the last peak vanished. The waters met above the Meneltarma, sealing the tomb of a kingdom. For a moment, there was only the churn of gray waves and the hiss of settling foam. Where a civilization had once stood, a new, empty sea now stretched to the horizon, its surface littered with the splintered bones of palaces and the broken masts of a fleet that had challenged the gods. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of absolute erasure. The island of Númenor, with all its glory and its pride, was gone, dragged down into a lightless chasm. Its towers and its temples, its libraries and its forges, all were now part of the drowned landscape of the seafloor. This was more than a flood. It was a moral obliteration. The very memory of the land was being washed from the face of the world, as if the Creator sought to undo a terrible mistake. What sounds do you think filled that new, empty ocean? Not the songs of sailors or the ringing of bells, but the slow, grinding creak of stone settling in the deep, and the whispers of currents passing over forgotten roads. The kingdom was not just destroyed, it was unmade, its name and its story seemingly swallowed by the very element it had once mastered. For 7 days and 7 nights, there was no sun and no moon, only a howling darkness. The 9 ships of the faithful were not sailing on an ocean anymore. They were being toyed with by a force of pure, mindless fury. Waves like black glass mountains rose around them, their crests torn into white spray by a wind that screamed with the voices of the drowned. There was no rest, no moment of calm. Every man, woman, and child aboard was reduced to a single, primal purpose: to cling to the shuddering deck and pray that the next wave would not be the one that finally sent them to join their kingdom below. Their world shrank to the groaning timbers of their ships and the sting of salt on their lips. They steered by a memory of the stars, a celestial map etched into the mind of their leader, Elendil, for there was no sky to guide them. The only light came from the terrifying, constant flash of lightning that illuminated the chaos for a split second, revealing the other ships as tiny, struggling shadows before plunging them back into utter blackness. In that relentless trial, what did they have to hold on to? Not treasure, for their wealth was at the bottom of the sea. Not power, for their titles were meaningless now. They had only their seamanship, a hard-won knowledge passed down through generations of mariners, and a desperate, stubborn hope. They had saved the seedling of the white tree, the symbol of their covenant, and that single act of faith became their anchor. Each time a wave threatened to swallow them, the memory of that living promise gave them the strength to bail water, to pull on a rope, to survive for one more hour. This was not merely a storm they were enduring. It was a crucible, a forge of the spirit. The pride of Númenor had been washed away, and in its place, this small, battered remnant was being hammered into something new, something harder and more resilient. Their resolve to find land, to plant their tree, and to build a kingdom that remembered the old truths was no longer a dream. It was the only thing keeping them afloat. That star was more than a light in the sky. It was a pardon. On the 9th day, the screaming winds finally began to falter, their fury spent. The mountainous waves subsided into a heavy, rolling swell, and for the first time in over a week, the clouds tore open. Not with a gentle parting, but with a ragged rent that revealed a single, brilliant star. Its light was not the cold fire of the lightning that had harried them, but a clear, steady radiance that seemed to spear the darkness directly above their battered fleet. And as that light touched them, a new wind rose, not a chaotic gale, but a strong, purposeful breath that filled their salt-crusted sails with a firm and steady hand. It pushed them eastward, away from the empty sea behind them, toward a dark, jagged line that had appeared on the horizon. It was land, not the lost curves of Númenor, but a raw, unknown coastline of gray cliffs and deep green forests. The sight was met not with cheers, but with a profound, trembling silence. They had been saved, but for what? This was not a homecoming. It was a beginning, and every soul aboard knew that the world they had known was gone forever. The star was their compass, the wind their guide, and this unknown shore their only future. Elendil, his face etched with exhaustion and a new, grim resolve, gave the order. They would steer for the land. In that single decision to trust the sign, their purpose was reforged. They were no longer refugees fleeing a dying past. They were pioneers, carrying the last ember of a lost civilization into a wild and waiting world. The salt-crusted hulls of their ships scraped against an unknown shore, the sound a welcome music after the endless roar of the sea. Elendil was the first to step onto the green turf, his legs unsteady on solid ground. He did not raise a sword in triumph or shout a declaration of conquest. Instead, the tall, weary king fell to his knees, his hands pressing into the cool, living earth of Middle-earth. His voice, though hoarse from the storm, was steady as he gave thanks for their deliverance, for the star that had guided them, and for the land that now offered them sanctuary. That simple act of gratitude was more powerful than any crown. It was a reaffirmation of the covenant that Númenor had broken, a promise to honor the natural order they had once defied. From that posture of humility, he rose as a founder. He proclaimed the establishment of Arnor, the North Kingdom. This was not merely the claiming of territory. It was the moment the exiles ceased to be refugees and became builders. Their purpose was instantly transformed. They would not just survive here, hiding in the wild. They would plant their white tree, raise cities from the stone of these hills, and forge a new realm dedicated to the old truths. The cornerstone of the Dunedain realms in Middle-earth was laid not with a shout of pride, but with a quiet, solemn vow spoken on a windswept shore, a vow to remember what was lost and to build something that would honor its memory. The Palantír was a sphere of dark, flawless crystal. Heavy with the weight of ages, Elendil carried it to the highest tower of his new capital, Númenor, a city rising from the mists of Lake Evendom. He did not place it there as a trophy or a symbol of dominion. He set it upon a stone pedestal with the care of a man handling a sleeping dragon, knowing its gaze could pierce the leagues of his fledgling kingdom. This was the Stone of Seeing, one of the few relics salvaged from the downfall, and its purpose was not for glory, but for guardianship. Through its depths, the vast, untamed lands of Arnor were laid bare before him. He could watch the slow, winding progress of settlers along the newly forged greenway, or scan the dark edges of the troll shaws for any sign of danger. It was an instrument of pure knowledge, a way to extend his protection over a people still trembling from the memory of a drowned world. This act transformed his rule from mere kingship into a sacred stewardship. His duty was no longer just a command, but to watch, to foresee, and to guard. The stone offered clarity, but it also demanded an unbreakable integrity, for the same power that could safeguard a realm could also corrupt the one who wielded it. Every time he looked into its impenetrable depths, he was making a silent vow to his people and to the memory of the lost, a promise that their new beginning would be guided by wisdom, not the pride that had shattered their past. Far to the south, where the white peaks of the misty mountains gave way to the wide plains, Isildur and his brother Anarion carved a second kingdom from the wilderness. They called it Gondor, the land of stone, and its heart was the city of Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, rising in terraced circles against the shoulder of Mount Mindilluin. Here, in the highest court of the city, Isildur performed the most sacred act of his new life. He took the sapling grown from Nimloth's fruit and planted it in the rich, dark earth, its pale leaves a stark and hopeful declaration against the stone. This was more than a ceremony. It was a promise etched into the very foundation of their realm, a living thread connecting their present to a past now drowned beneath the waves. The white tree stood as a silent witness and a judge, a reminder that their authority was derived not from conquest, but from a covenant they dared not break again. For a time, peace seemed possible. The seasons turned, farms flourished in the fertile valleys, and the sounds of construction echoed where once only wolves had howled. Yet always, their gaze was drawn eastward, to the jagged, brooding line of the Juath, the mountains of shadow, which guarded the blighted land of Mordor. It was from beyond those peaks that the whispers began, carried by dusty travelers and grim-faced rangers. They spoke of a shadow without a source, a nameless dread solidifying in the dark. Orcs, which had scattered after the downfall, were now gathering again with a purpose they had not shown for an age. A new will was moving them, a conscious malice that watched the growing strength of Gondor with a cold and patient hatred. The peace of their new beginning was revealed as a fragile illusion, a brief calm before a storm they had unknowingly sailed toward. The shadow of their old enemy had not drowned with Númenor. It had simply been waiting for them to build something worth destroying. Whispers from the east hardened into a certainty they could no longer ignore. The shadow in Mordor had a name, and it was a name they knew all too well. Sauron had survived the drowning of Númenor. His spirit, disembodied but undiminished, had fled back to Middle-earth, and there, in the fires of Orodruin, he had forged a new form and a new plan for dominion. He was no longer a cunning counselor whispering in a king's ear. He was a war leader, marshalling armies of orcs and monstrous beasts, his gaze fixed on extinguishing the last lights of the West. The fledgling kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor stood directly in his path. To hide behind their new walls was to invite a slow, suffocating siege. Elendil and his sons understood that their survival, and the survival of all they had built, demanded not defense, but a desperate, decisive stroke. Elendil, the High King of the Dunedain, sent out a call, not as a command, but as a plea for alliance, and from the grey havens of Lindon and the golden woods of Lothlorien, an answer came. The elven High King Gil-galad, bearing his legendary spear Eglos, pledged his people to this cause. It was a moment that echoed through the ages. The two great houses of the world, elves and men, whose histories had so often been marked by separation and sorrow, now joined their banners under a single purpose. They would not wait for the darkness to come to them. They would march into the heart of the shadow and break its power forever. This was the last alliance, a final, glorious stand against the night, a union born not from conquest, but from the shared understanding that some evils must be faced, no matter the cost. The fate of the Númenorian exiles was now irrevocably bound to the larger tapestry of Middle-earth. Their war was no longer just for their own kingdoms, but for the very freedom of the world. The air itself tasted of ash and burnt iron on the plains of Gorgoroth. Before the Alliance lay the Black Gate, a gaping maw into a land of shadows, and before that, a sea of armored orcs that stretched to the fiery mountain Orodruin. There was no elegant strategy left, only the grim arithmetic of attrition. The battle began not with a single charge, but with a slow, grinding collision of two worlds. Spears of elven silver met crude scimitars of black steel. The songs of the Eldar, fair and terrible, were drowned out by the guttural war cries of countless orcs. It was a slaughter measured in inches, each forward step paid for with the blood of heroes. Elendil and Gil-galad fought not as distant commanders, but as pillars of light in the fray, their very presence holding the line against the crushing tide of darkness. They knew this could not last. Victory, if it could be won at all, required cutting the head from the serpent. Their gaze was fixed on the dark tower of Barad-dûr and the terrible figure that now emerged from its gate. Sauron himself strode onto the field, and in that moment, the battle seemed to freeze. He was no longer the deceiver of Númenor, but a being of pure, incarnate malice, clad in black armor and wielding a power that made the very ground tremble. He came for the High Kings. The hope of all free peoples narrowed to that single, desperate duel at the mountain's base. Elendil and Gil-galad, the last scions of two glorious ages, stood together against the one who had orchestrated the downfall of their past and now threatened to extinguish their future. The fight was catastrophic, a storm of fire and divine light. Sauron's strength was beyond any mortal or elven frame, his mace a weapon of ruin. In the end, their sacrifice was the only currency that could purchase victory. Gil-galad was burned alive by the heat of Sauron's hand. Elendil, the king who had carried his people from the waves, was thrown down and slain, his great sword Narsil breaking beneath him. Their lives, freely given, created a single, fleeting opening, a chance for one last, decisive act in a war that had cost everything. Isildur saw his father fall. The sight was not just a personal agony, it was the shattering of his world. King Elendil, the great pillar of their people, lay broken on the ground, and the sword of the Dunedain, Narsil, was in pieces beside him. In that instant, all the hope of the last alliance seemed to die with its kings. But then Sauron, the great and terrible enemy, stepped forward, his shadow falling over the slain. His victory seemed absolute, and his very presence was a wave of despair meant to break the last resistance. Isildur, however, did not break. A desperate, defiant instinct took over. He did not flee from the terror. He scrambled across the blood-soaked ground, his hand closing not around the hilt of a whole sword, but around the jagged, fire-sharded remnant of Narsil. It was not a weapon fit for a king. It was a broken tool, a fragment of a greater whole. Yet in that moment, it was enough. As Sauron loomed over him, Isildur drove the sharpened stump of the blade upward, putting all his grief and rage into a single, desperate stroke. The shard found its mark, severing the finger upon which Sauron wore the One Ring. The Dark Lord's form did not bleed. It convulsed with a shriek of pure, unmaking fury, a sound that tore the fabric of the world. His power, so concentrated in that golden band, ruptured. His spirit tore free from its physical form, not as a retreat, but as a catastrophic explosion of will that left nothing but a hollow suit of armor collapsing to the ground. The war was over. The immediate threat was gone. But then, in the sudden, ringing silence, Isildur's gaze fell upon the ring. It lay on the ground, a simple, unadorned circle of gold, still warm from its master's hand. The battle was won, but a new, more subtle conflict began within the heir's own heart. He saw the ring not as an object of evil, but as a prize. He saw it as weregild, an ancient rite of compensation, a payment in blood for the murder of his father and his king. It felt like justice. To leave it here, in the filth of this battlefield, seemed a sacrilege. It was a thing of immense power, and was not power what they had fought and died for. His hand, almost of its own accord, reached down and took it. It was a choice made in a haze of victory and grief, a decision that felt right and righteous in the moment. He believed he could master it, that this symbol of their enemy's strength could become a tool for their own rebuilding. In that single act of claiming a trophy, Isildur secured the victory of the free peoples, but he also allowed the very heart of the enemy to survive. He planted a seed, small and seemingly inert, that would one day grow into a shadow long enough to darken all of Middle-earth once more. The heat of Orodruin was a physical weight against their faces. Elrond led Isildur away from the carnage of the battlefield, up the winding, ash-choked path to the very heart of the mountain. The air itself tasted of sulfur and ancient fire, and the roar from the chasm ahead was the voice of the earth's forge. They stood together at the crack of doom, a gaping fissure where the fires of creation still raged. Below them, the molten rock churned in a lake of liquid light. Elrond's voice was calm but urgent, cutting through the oppressive din. He spoke not as a warrior, but as a herald of a deeper truth. He counseled Isildur to cast the ring into the fire, to end the threat of Sauron forever. This was the only way to ensure the shadow could not return. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated choice, a chance to secure the peace they had just purchased with so much blood. But Isildur did not see a weapon of the enemy. He looked at the golden band in his palm and saw something else entirely. He saw his father, Elendil, broken on the ground. He saw the kingdom of his birth, drowned beneath an angry sea. He saw all that had been taken from him, In his grief, the ring became more than an object. It became a prize, a payment, a symbol of a loss so profound he could not bear to part with it. His refusal was not one of malice, but of a wounded heart. He called it an heirloom of his house, a weregild for the death of his father. In that moment, his personal sorrow and the pride of his lineage blinded him to the greater danger. He believed he could master it, that this power could be a tool for the rebuilding of his kingdom. He turned away from the fire, and in doing so, he allowed the very soul of the enemy to walk free, a dormant seed of shadow that would one day grow to threaten the world all over again. The golden band felt strangely cold against Isildur's chest. He rode north with the tattered remnant of his guard, the weight of kingship now his alone to bear. The high hopes of victory had faded into the grim reality of a journey home through a world still scarred by war. His mind was not on the path ahead, but on the prize he carried, a secret comfort and a private burden. He believed the ring was a tool of his house, a right earned by blood and sacrifice. He did not understand that it had a will of its own, a silent, patient malice that was already at work. As his company entered the low, misty marshes known as the Gladden Fields, the very air seemed to grow heavy with a watchful stillness. The reeds did not rustle with the wind, and the croaking of frogs fell silent. It was a perfect trap. From the murky water and the thickets of willow, a host of orcs erupted. They were not a disorganized rabble, but hunters, sent with a specific purpose. They had been drawn, not by chance, but by the dark object their master so desperately desired to reclaim. The battle was swift and brutal. Isildur's men, weary from the long war and the longer road, were surrounded and cut down. Seeing the hopelessness of the fight, Isildur did what any seasoned commander would do. He broke for the river, hoping the current would carry him to safety. He tore off his heavy elven mail, the very armor that had protected him on the battlefield, and plunged into the cold, dark water. He began to swim, the far shore his only thought. But then it happened. The ring, which had felt so secure, made its final treacherous choice. As he struggled against the current, the band of gold simply slipped from his finger, as if of its own volition, and vanished into the deep, murky water. In that single, catastrophic moment, Isildur was no longer a king carrying a trophy. He was a man stripped of all his power, utterly and completely betrayed. He flailed in the water, a cry of horror and realization torn from his lips. It was in that vulnerable instant, exposed and helpless, that the orc arrows found him. The heir of Elendil, the man who had stood against Sauron himself, was slain not in glorious combat, but in a muddy river, brought down by the very thing he believed he controlled. His choice to claim the ring did not just cost him his life. It left his fledgling kingdom of Arnor without its high king at the very moment it needed strong leadership most. And it cast the One Ring into obscurity, lost for centuries in the silt of a forgotten river, a sleeping poison waiting for the day it would be found again. The river's betrayal echoed for generations in the sundered halls of the Dunedain. With Isildur's death, the single hope for a reunited kingdom died with him. His sons, inheriting the ravaged north, found their rule a constant struggle against the creeping wilderness and the slow fading of their people. In the south, Meneldil, the son of Anarion, solidified his own power in Gondor. a realm already rich with cities and fleets. The vast, empty leagues between them were no longer a shared domain, but a chasm of separation. The high kingship of Elendil became an empty title, a memory of unity that the practical demands of survival could no longer sustain. What began as a geographical necessity hardened into a political and cultural divide. Arnor in the north faced scattered tribes and the slow, cold decay of its own numbers, its people becoming rangers and wardens of a dwindling land. Gondor in the south, by contrast, looked east and south, its gaze fixed on the maritime trade and the constant, looming threat of Mordor. They built different kinds of fortresses and told different versions of their own history. The shared trauma of the downfall, the very glue that had bound their founders, faded into a distant legend, replaced by the immediate and separate challenges of ruling in the present. The strength that had come from a single throne and a shared purpose was now diluted, split between two crowns that rarely communicated, their shared blood growing thinner and more forgetful with every passing year. The shadow in Mordor had not been idle. While Gondor's kings looked to their own borders, a deeper darkness was stirring in the mountains to the east. The Tower of the Moon, Minas Ithil, had long been a proud outpost, guarding the pass into that blighted land, its white walls a defiant answer to the gloom of the Epheljuath. But its greatest strength became its most terrible weakness. Within its highest chamber rested one of the Seeing Stones, the Ithil Stone, a Palantír meant to watch over the land. It was this very stone that the enemy desired. When his forces finally swept down upon the city, the assault was not merely one of armies. The Ithil Stone was captured, and in that moment, its nature was inverted. No longer a tool of guardianship, it became a weapon of espionage and terror. Through its depths, the enemy could now peer directly into the strategic heart of Gondor, turning their own sight against them. The city's defenders found their plans anticipated, their movements foreseen, their very thoughts seemingly laid bare. It was a defeat from within, a spiritual corruption that preceded the physical fall. The fair white towers were defiled, their moon-pale marble taking on a sickly, phosphorescent glow. The place was renamed Minas Morgul, the Tower of Sorcery, and it became the seat of the Nazgul, the 9 terrible servants of the Ringwraiths. This was more than the loss of a fortress. It was the loss of an eye, a catastrophic breach in Gondor's defenses that allowed the shadow to look in whenever it chose. The long peace was truly over, replaced by a cold war where every plan had to be made in the grim knowledge that the enemy might be watching. How do you fight a war when your enemy can see your every move before you make it? The fall of Minas Ithil taught Gondor a bitter lesson, that the greatest threats are often the ones you never see coming. The last king of Gondor rode to his doom with a crown upon his brow and despair in his heart. Arnor was a man of fiery temper, and when the Lord of the Nazgul issued a final, mocking challenge from the gates of Minas Morgul, he could not ignore the insult. His counselors pleaded with him to see the trap for what it was, a lure spun from pride, but the king saw only a stain upon his honor, a debt that could only be paid in blood. He rode out with his knights, a company of glory that passed into the shadows of the Morgul Vale and vanished from all record. No song tells of their last stand. No herald returned to tell the tale. They were simply swallowed by the silence of the enemy, leaving the throne of Gondor empty, a chair that echoed with the ghosts of a broken line. In that terrible silence, a new voice had to speak for the kingdom. The steward Martel Vorenwe, who had long governed in the king's name, now took up the full burden of rule. He swore an oath, not of conquest, but of guardianship. He would rule until the king returned. It was a vow meant to steady a reeling nation, a promise that this was not an ending, but a pause. Yet as years turned into decades, and decades into centuries, that pause became a permanent state of being. The stewards were capable and dedicated rulers, holding back the tides of shadow with grim determination. But their authority was always borrowed, their legitimacy a question that hung in the air of every council chamber. They sat in a low chair at the foot of the royal dais, a constant physical reminder that they were only keepers, not heirs. This long stewardship created a profound internal conflict within the kingdom, a quiet tension between the practical need for strong leadership and the aching, almost religious hope for a return that never came. How do you build a future when your government is founded on the premise of a past that might never be restored? The age of the stewards was an age of waiting, a vigil kept in a fortress that was slowly, imperceptibly, forgetting the sound of a king's voice. While the stewards of Gondor guarded a vacant throne, the true heir to its crown was growing up in a hidden valley far to the north. In the timeless halls of Rivendell, a young boy named Aragorn learned his letters and his sword craft, unaware that the weight of a drowned kingdom and a sundered lineage rested upon his small shoulders. Lord Elrond, who had stood with his ancestor at the crack of doom, had taken him in as a foster son, giving him the name Estel, which means hope. This was not merely a name, but a shield. For the enemy, though wounded, was ever watchful, and the line of Isildur was a flickering flame that Sauron longed to extinguish. Aragorn's entire childhood was a carefully constructed secret, a life lived in the open, yet hidden in plain sight. His royal blood, the most dangerous truth he could not yet be trusted to know. He was trained not as a prince expecting a crown, but as a ranger who would need to survive in the wild. His lessons were those of the frontier: how to track a deer by a broken twig, how to read the weather in the shape of a cloud, and how to treat a fever with herbs from the forest floor. This grounding in the realities of the land, in the struggles of common folk, would prove more valuable than any lesson in courtly etiquette. It instilled in him a profound humility, a sense that true strength was not in commanding others, but in understanding and serving them. When Elrond finally revealed his true name and lineage on his 20th birthday, the knowledge did not spark arrogance, but a deep and solemn sense of responsibility. The boy Estel was gone, and in his place stood Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the last heir of a line that had been forged in the fires of loss and tempered by centuries of exile. His preparation had been one of substance, not just style, building the inner fortitude of a king long before he would ever be offered a throne. A river's current kept its secret for 2,500 years. On a day of fishing and simple pleasure, a young hobbit named Déagol was pulled from his boat by a large, cold fish. As he struggled in the murky water, his hand brushed against something smooth and round resting in the riverbed silt. He surfaced, gasping, and unclenched his fist to find a simple, beautiful ring of pure gold. It was flawless and heavy, seeming to drink the sunlight rather than reflect it. His cousin Smeagol, who had been with him, was immediately captivated. The The ring seemed to whisper a promise of possession that coiled around his heart. He did not ask to see it. He demanded it, claiming it as a birthday present, though his birthday was far off. When Dagorlad refused, clutching the ring to his chest, something dark and terrible snapped within Smaugall. He did not argue. He did not plead. His hands, which had shared many meals with his friend, closed around Dagorlad's throat and did not let go. The first murder in the gentle history of their people was committed for a trinket, a seemingly innocent prize from the river. In that single, violent moment, the long-lost ring of power chose its new path back into the world, using the most unsuspecting of vessels. Smaugall took his prize and fled from the sun, from the green fields and the faces of his family. The ring's malice, patient and subtle, had found a heart already susceptible to envy and secrecy. He crawled into the roots of the misty mountains, finding a deep, wet cave where the only light was a sickly glow from fungi on the walls. The world above forgot him, and he, in turn, forgot everything but his precious. His body twisted, his mind frayed, and over the centuries, the hobbit Smaugall was utterly erased, replaced by the wretched, whispering creature known as Gollum. He did not understand the power he held, only the consuming need to possess it. In that dark cave, the ring waited, biding its time until the world outside was once again ripe for its particular brand of ruin. Deep in the mountain's roots, a small, slimy creature fished in a cold black lake. Gollum had lived with his precious for 500 years, whispering to it and hating it, loving it and fearing its loss. He did not know it was a ring of power, only that it was his birthday present, and he was its master. But the ring had grown weary of its lonely guardian. It desired a new bearer, one who could be drawn out of the dark and into the wider world, so it simply let go. During a fierce quarrel with himself in the tunnels, Gollum's precious slipped from his finger and fell with a silent, insignificant plink into the water. His shriek of loss echoed through the caverns, a sound of pure, unraveling agony. He scrabbled and searched the slimy floor for years, but the ring was gone, lying dormant and patient on the sandy bottom, waiting for a different kind of hand to find it. It waited for centuries, a seed of ultimate evil buried in the dark, until the day a most unlikely gardener stumbled into the tunnels. Bilbo Baggins was a hobbit, lost, frightened, and separated from his dwarf companions. Groping blindly in the oppressive blackness, his hand brushed against a small, cold circle of metal. Almost without thinking, he slipped it into his pocket. It was a simple act, an accident of fate. He had no desire for power, no ambition for conquest. He was merely a creature of comfort and good heart, motivated by a wish to see the sky again. Yet in that single, unthinking moment, the entire fate of Middle-earth pivoted. The ring, which had festered in a heart of greed, now found itself in a pocket of innocence. It was a perfect disguise. Bilbo felt no immediate corruption, only a strange sense of luck. He used it to escape the goblin tunnels and the creature Gollum, never realizing the true nature of the trinket in his pocket. This chance discovery by a gentle soul was the first, crucial step in the ring's long, patient journey home, setting it on a path that would eventually lead it back to the fire that forged it, or to the hand of the Dark Lord who waited. The quiet halls of Rivendell were filled with attention the valley had not known for an age. Elves, men, and a dwarf sat in solemn council, their voices a low murmur beneath the rustling leaves. Each had come bearing their own grim news, each a piece of a puzzle that now revealed a terrifying whole. The shadow in the east was not merely rearming, it was hunting, its entire will bent toward the recovery of the One Ring. And there, on a simple stone pedestal, the golden band lay, its serene beauty a mask for the absolute evil it contained. The history was laid bare, from its forging in the fires of Orodruin to its betrayal of Isildur in the river, its long corruption of Gollum in the dark, and its chance discovery by a hobbit who knew nothing of its power. The peril was absolute. It could not be used, for it would corrupt any wielder. It could not be hidden, for Sauron's gaze would eventually find it. It could not be destroyed by any strength of arms they possessed. There was only one path, a path so desperate it seemed like madness. The ring had to be carried into the very heart of the Land of Shadow and cast back into the fire from which it was made. A heavy silence fell over the council as the weight of this conclusion settled upon them. Who could possibly bear such a burden, to walk voluntarily into the lion's den, knowing the entire way they would be hunted by the most powerful being in Middle-earth? It was the hobbit, Frodo Baggins, who broke the silence. His voice was small, yet it carried with a strange and steady clarity. He would take it. He would take the ring to Mordor. In that moment, the entire course of the war shifted. It was not a king, nor a warrior, nor a wizard who accepted this fate, but the smallest of folk, whose greatest strength was not in his arm, but in his resilient heart. His courage was a spark that ignited the resolve of others. A kingless man, an elven prince, a dwarf lord, and his own hobbit friends all rose to stand with him. A fellowship bound not by a command, but by a shared oath to protect the ring-bearer on his impossible quest. The decision of one humble being had united the free peoples in a common purpose, committing their fates to a single, fragile thread of hope. The time for hiding had passed. Aragorn stood before the black, gaping mouth of the Dimhold, a cavern that breathed out a cold more profound than any winter. This was the Paths of the Dead, a place cursed for 1,000 years, where the very air tasted of ancient betrayal. The men of the White Mountains had sworn an oath to fight for the last king of Gondor, Isildur himself, but when war came, they had broken their vow and hid in their hills. For their faithlessness, Isildur had laid a curse upon them, condemning their spirits to walk the shadows of their mountain halls until a true heir summoned them to fulfill their promise. Now, with Gondor besieged and all hope fading, that heir stood at the threshold. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, had to prove his lineage not with words, but with the courage to walk into the heart of terror itself. He did not march with a proud army at his back, only a handful of loyal companions, the Dunedain of the north. Their footsteps echoed not with the confidence of conquerors, but with the grim resolve of men stepping into a tomb. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical weight that pressed upon their eyes and lungs. They lit no torches, for what light could possibly challenge a shadow this old? They moved by touch and by faith, the silence broken only by the whisper of unseen things brushing past in the chill air. The terror was not of a physical enemy they could fight, but of a despair that gnawed at the edges of their sanity, a whispering doubt that questioned the very purpose of their quest. In that oppressive blackness, Aragorn's authority was tested not by a challenger, but by the creeping fear in his own heart. Could he truly command the allegiance of the dead? Or would he and his friends simply be swallowed by the mountain, forgotten like the Oathbreakers themselves? Then, a pale, green light began to glow, illuminating a vast cavern filled with a countless, shimmering host. They were not solid, but figures of mist and memory, their eyes hollow with the regret of centuries. They did not attack, they simply watched, a silent, judgmental audience to the living man who dared to disturb their rest. Aragorn's voice cut through the spectral silence, ringing with an authority inherited from the king who had cursed them. He did not plead, he summoned. He called them forth by the oath they had broken, demanding they follow the heir of Isildur to war. It was a demand that echoed with the full weight of his lineage, a command that brooked no refusal. The spectral army began to move, a tide of silent ghosts flowing from the mountain, a force that could not be slain, driven by a debt that was finally due. This was not a conquest, it was a collection. Aragorn emerged from the darkness not with a living army, but with the restless conscience of a forgotten age, a weapon of pure terror that would sweep towards the coasts of Gondor, where the ships of the enemy threatened to strangle the last free city. He had turned a curse into a covenant, and in doing so, gathered the only force that could arrive in time to turn the tide. The fire of Ordruin was the only light in that cavern of shadows, its roar a deafening hunger. Frodo stood at the very edge of the crack of doom, the golden ring heavy in his hand, no longer a burden to be carried, but a prize to be claimed. The quest was over, the long road complete, yet in that final moment, the rings will finally overwhelm his own. His voice, once gentle, was a harsh and alien sound as he declared the ring his own, and he slipped it onto his finger, vanishing from sight. He did not cast it into the fire. He claimed it for himself, the entire structure of Sauron's power, which had been pressing inward upon the mountain, suddenly focused into a single point of pure, panicked fury. The Dark Lord knew exactly where his masterwork was, and who now held it, but it was not a great hero who intervened. It was the creature he had so long forgotten. Gollum, driven by a desperate, obsessive love for his precious, had followed them every step of the way. Invisible, Frodo felt the wiry, frantic strength of the creature as he was seized. They struggled on the brink of the abyss, a terrible, silent fight between the invisible bearer and the thing that had been corrupted long before him. Then came the bite, a sharp, searing pain as Gollum, in his mad triumph, sank his teeth into the finger that bore the ring, severing it. For a single, dizzying moment, Gollum stood there, dancing on the edge, the ring held aloft in his hand, his shrieks of victory echoing through the chamber. His joy was his undoing. He tottered, lost his footing, and with a final, fading cry, fell into the heart of the fire. The ring was gone, consumed in the fury it had helped to create. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The dark tower of Barad-dûr, which had stood for an age through sheer force of will, crumbled into dust. The armies of Mordor, which had moments before been on the verge of total victory, dissolved into mindless terror. The great, oppressive eye of Sauron, a presence that had weighed upon the world for centuries, was simply extinguished, its power shattered into a billion forgotten fragments. The quest had succeeded, but not through strength of arms or heroic will. It was the mercy Bilbo had shown so long ago, the pity Frodo had extended in the dark, that brought Gollum to this place to play his part. It was a resolution born of chance and compassion, a chain of events so fragile that no one could have planned it. the world was saved, yet Frodo, the one who had borne the burden furthest, would never know true peace again. The memory of the rings touched a wound that would never fully heal. The shadow had passed, and a long-awaited light finally dawned over the White City. With Sauron's fall, the age of guardianship was over. The heir of Elendil had returned. Aragorn, now crowned King Elessar Telconter, did not take the throne by conquest, but by right and by the acclamation of a people who had almost forgotten the face of their king. His coronation was not a celebration of power, but a restoration of order, a mending of the broken thread that had snapped with Isildur's death so many centuries before. The crown of Gondor, which had sat in silence through the long years of the Stewards, was placed upon his brow, and the very stones of Minas Tirith seemed to sigh with a relief as deep as the foundations of the earth. This was more than a political event. It was a homecoming for a lineage that had been forged in the drowning of one world and tested in the wilderness of another. And with his kingship came a union that sang of hope for all the ages to come. He wed Arwen Undying, the even star of her people, the daughter of Elrond. In their bond, the ancient rift between elves and men was finally, beautifully healed. Their love was a living bridge between the fading magic of the firstborn and the vibrant, mortal destiny of humankind. A promise that the new age would be built not on separation, but on a shared and glorious memory. In the courtyard of the citadel, where the dead tree had stood as a grim memorial for so long, a miracle quietly took root. From the seed of the sapling Isildur had saved, a new white tree of Gondor was planted. It did not burst into bloom overnight, but in its own time it flowered, its pale petals a stark and lovely contrast against the dark stone. This was not the arrogant, unchanging glory of ancient Númenor. This was a different kind of splendor, one that understood the cycles of death and rebirth, of loss and renewal. The tree was a living symbol that the past was not erased, but transformed. It honored the memory of the lost island, not as a cautionary tale of prideful failure, but as the necessary foundation for a wiser, more humble kingdom. The Dunedain of the south and the Rangers of the north were one people again, their shared heritage no longer a source of division, but a wellspring of strength. The wisdom salvaged from the downfall, the scrolls saved by the faithful, and the hard lessons learned in exile, all these became the guiding principles of King Elessar's reign. He ruled for 120 years of peace, a time of rebuilding and reconciliation, where the memory of the drowned kingdom lived on not as a ghost of what was lost, but as the deep root from which the age of men finally and rightfully grew.